Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Conversations with the Dean. I'm Penny Bishop, and I have the privilege of serving as the Dean of BU Wheelock College of Education and Human Development. This happens to be one of my favorite days, actually, of the month, when BU Wheelock experts and guests help us to make sense of what's happening in the world. Today's focus is on student enrollment. Over the past 5 years, student enrollment in Massachusetts has shifted dramatically. Public school enrollment is down, private school enrollment is up, and homeschooling has surged, especially among certain communities. And today we'll explore what these changes mean for the policy and future of our schools. I'm joined this afternoon by 3 panelists who each bring a helpful, informed perspective as researchers, administrators, and policy influencers. So first off, I'm happy to introduce Dr. Joshua Goodman, Associate Professor of Education and Economics at BU Wheelock and Director of the Master's Program in Education Policy Studies. Josh is the lead researcher on today's topic, studying how education policies work in the real world using big data and careful analysis. Before earning his PhD, he taught high school math, and he has been consistently named one of the top 200 most influential university-based scholars in education policy and practice. We're also joined by Dr. Stacy Scott, who's a senior lecturer in educational leadership and policy studies here at BU Wheelock. Stacy explores innovation, intuition, and storytelling in education. And over his career, he's been a teacher, diversity director, psychologist, consultant, principal, and superintendent. So he's bringing a wide range of experience to his work with schools and leaders to today's conversation. And last but not least, alumna Mary Bourque is Executive Director of the Massachusetts Association of School Superintendents and a lifelong advocate for educational equity. A former Chelsea Public Schools teacher and superintendent, Mary has led urban reform, mentored teachers, and shaped state policy. And I'm delighted to also mention that Mary is this year's recipient of the prestigious Lucy Wheelock Award, which is BU Wheelock's highest alumni award. So welcome, Josh, Stacy, and Mary, and thank you for joining us today, and particularly you, Mary, and my apologies, I think it's Mary Bourque and I said Bourque. Mary Bourque, who is zooming in from the New England Association of School Superintendents. We really appreciate it when alums can join our conversations as well. So let's begin. We have a lot to talk about. Folks in the audience, I want you to please put your questions in the Q&A box for us to integrate into our conversation. I know you'll have lots of them, and we'll do our very best to get to as many as possible. So let's start by grounding ourselves in the data. Student enrollment in Massachusetts over the past 5 years tells quite a story. Down 2% in public schools. So enrollment is down 2% in public schools, up 16% in private schools, and up a whopping 50% in homeschooling. And losses like this are most pronounced in higher income districts, among white and Asian families, and in the middle grades. And public school enrollment hasn't bounced back to pre-pandemic levels. Josh, when I read those numbers, I thought I was misreading. That is pretty extraordinary. And I'm wondering if, for those in the audience who might not be familiar with your research on this, could you briefly summarize your key findings from this study and maybe also tell us a little bit about what first drew your attention and interest to these enrollment shifts?
Sure. Well, I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. It's great to have this conversation in dialogue. I look at data and spreadsheets, but I'm very excited to be in dialogue with people who are or have been school leaders thinking about these issues. Just 1 minute worth of background here. I had written a couple of research papers very early in the pandemic, focusing on this question of what schooling choices people were making in the midst of school closures, disputes about vaccines, mask mandates. And the background here is that in the fall of 2020, public school enrollments across the US fell by something like 3%, which was the largest single year-to-year drop since World War II encouraged a bunch of high schoolers to get drafted by the military. And so we wrote a couple of papers sort of studying where these students were going. It was often to private schools among rich families or higher income families. It was often to homeschooling among lower income families who were worried about the physical effects of the virus itself. But we didn't see much follow-up beyond that first year or two of the pandemic. It's been now 5 years, and we wanted to know the folks who left those schools or made the decisions never to enter the public schools in the first place, were those patterns remaining now that we're far beyond the point of school closures and mask mandates and vaccination concerns, or was there some persistence in these change decisions? And so the great thing about Massachusetts is that it makes publicly available its data on school enrollments in extremely timely fashion, which is not true of many states. And so we're really grateful to the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, which runs a public-facing data hub where anyone can get this data. And what we did was to take it and just ask the question, once we control for the fact that there have been some trends in enrollment even prior to the pandemic, has the pandemic changed any of those enrollment trends? And so what we found was that there has been a noticeable drop, even 5 years later, relative to where we thought public school enrollment would be. And that is a drop of about 2%. And the way to think about that is there are about 20,000 missing students who we would have predicted would have been in public schools, but because of the pandemic are not. Where did those students go? Well, we saw a really sharp increase relative to trend in how many students were enrolled in private schools. Something on the order of, I can't remember, something like 12,000 students, perhaps. Another sharp increase in homeschooling. It has leveled off a little bit since that initial fall 2020 push, but it's actually still elevated at a rate 50% higher than it used to be pre-pandemic. So that's another 3,000 to 4,000 students who are doing homeschooling who wouldn't have if not for the pandemic. And so the goal of this research is to, I think, really spark some conversations about why did the pandemic trigger those different choices among families? Who are the families that made those choices? And if you're an advocate for public schools, are there things that public schools can be doing to bring those families back into the sector?
Thank you, Josh. That's so helpful. Mary, I'd love to turn to you from the superintendent's perspective to tell us a little bit about how superintendents are interpreting these trends, what the impact of these trends is on our public schools, and if you're seeing peers take deliberate action in response to these shifts.
Well, thank you. And thank you for the invitation to be here this afternoon with all of you. First, Josh's research and data is so very important, because what we need to do is we need to red flag this trend that has become an established pattern. But we also have to, add in there our gateway cities this year in particular already have leading indicators that there is an immigrant exodus from our state. So we do think that the numbers will even be more than what Josh has uncovered. So what it tells me, though, from Josh is that, this is very contextual. At the same time, the loss of our students, our superintendents most certainly are concerned, because that impacts budget, it impacts resources. But we need to become diagnosticians. We need to ask why. And so across the board, contextually, why are our students leaving? But also to asking the question, why are other families staying? Because we are looking at being able to become, as public education, we really need to start thinking about becoming more customer oriented and really wrapping around our families in terms of what they're saying is needed. And so in terms of our superintendents, right now they're concerned, but we're telling them to monitor this. At the same time, get out in front of it. Start your interviews. Interview your students who have left, your families who have left. Interview your families who are leaving. For many of our superintendents, it's a time to think about, do we need to reassess? Do we need to reassess our programming, our structures, our systems, our staffing models? And it's also time to plan for multiple contingency plans on budgeting as the numbers come out in December and January for fiscal 27, which will begin July 1st.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems like we're all having to do a lot of that scenario planning these days, isn't it? Multiple contingencies. Thank you very much, Mary. Stacy, you have worn many hats and continue to wear many hats. I'm wondering if perhaps for this part of the conversation, you can wear a principal hat. Given what you've seen And given what Mary has just offered from that perspective, what tools or strategies can schools use to re-engage families who've stepped away? Mary talked a bit about sort of turning to them to understand the reasons. What do you have to add to that? Oh, and I think you might be muted. There we go.
As always, Mary's right on target there, and I want to sort of pick up where she left off. I think that first, Josh's research is always so valuable, and I really appreciate being able to work with him in our department as a colleague. Mary's right on target that there's a lot of change going on, and it's going to continue. I think that the biggest issue that I'll start off with is that there's a strong public skepticism about schools, and that there's a disconnect between our families and what schools could, should, or would be doing. And so our greatest challenge is to figure out how do we build trust again with our families. My experience is actually more than being a principal was actually training hundreds, perhaps even thousands of principals around the country as they prepared for leadership, and even now in Boston and other cities working with principals. And they're struggling because actually their arms are full with the students that they do have. So they're worried less about the fact that they may have fewer. But they're more so worried about how are they going to bridge the gap and bridge this trust gap. I think that the strategies that we want to be thinking of, picking up from where Mary was, it's really kind of a marketing and a branding issue. How do we attempt to create a bridge, re-engage families in a way that causes them to feel like they are a part of the school? The studies all show that increased engagement from parents improves outcomes for schools and for students in terms of attendance, in terms of student performance, and also just in terms of the overall sense of inclusion, and particularly the welcome that parents need to feel. So our first order of business is to sort of think again about how do we reach out to families? Do we provide volunteer opportunities for parents to be able to connect with the school? Do we make sure that they understand what the homework opportunities are for students? Do we create online community activities? Do we create classes for parents to be able to get into the school, ESL classes or other ways for them to connect? Last thing maybe I'll say, and I can save some more for later, that they're doing surveys of parents so that we understand the ways in which families want to be engaged. Do they understand that if the more engaged they are, the higher literacy outcomes that we get, higher attendance outcomes we get, the more they connect, the more we know what their needs are. And that's so important for being able to effectively meet the needs of their students and therefore build their trust and make them want to bring their students back. I'll stop there. I can add more later.
Thank you, Stacy. I appreciate your emphasis on family engagement and the point that you make about not all that we don't know how families necessarily want to be engaged and that there are different ways. So thanks for bringing that forward. A guest, Katie from Chelsea, has asked a question that I'm going to use as a jumping off point to come back to you, Josh. So Katie is from the lovely gateway city of Chelsea, which welcomes all regardless of citizenship. We are facing a drop in enrollment that we believe is tied to tightening immigration policies on the federal level. Can you speak to how Massachusetts schools are navigating the drop in enrollment due to fears around immigration? So this speaks to something that Mary mentioned briefly earlier. And I'm wondering, and it's part of this broader question that I have for you, Josh, around the enrollment story varying based on community, that it's not the same story for all communities. So could you respond to that?
Sure. Hi, Katzi. Katzi was a student in at least one of my classes, and she's a member of the Chelsea school. She's on the Chelsea school committee. So
and my apologies, Kati, for mispronouncing your name.
So. It's okay. I'm glad she's here. So a couple of things. One is, and I'm really glad that Katzi and Mary brought this up. The data in our study, we were so excited that it went all the way through last school year, which is the point at which we started writing the study. And we were very excited to be able to write about what's going on in that school year that we were writing about. But the change in immigration patterns and enrollment is obviously newer than last fall. It's really a this fall story. And so it is not captured in the work. I just want to be very clear about that. I absolutely agree with Mary that in about, I think, 2 months, the state will make publicly available the data that we've been using in our study so we could update with this next year. And I expect we're going to see exactly what Mary's talking about, which is in immigrant-heavy communities. You're going to see enrollment pressures and declines. To be clear, that's actually not what we'd seen in the previous 5 years. The patterns we'd seen in the data that is in the study that we have in its current form suggested that actually in more diverse communities in low and middle income communities in Massachusetts, actually the enrollment losses have somewhat recovered and are now only, those districts were only, as of last year, something like 1% below what we would have expected. Where the biggest losses have occurred, again, as of last year, was in the high income communities. So the wealthiest 20% of school districts in Massachusetts lost more public school students than the other 80% of school districts combined as of last year. And so I suspect that the story there is something about higher income parents in those districts leaving for private schools. That's a very different story than what may be playing out now in districts like Chelsea and other places where fears about immigration enforcement may be driving students out of the system. So just wanted to be clear that there are a lot of different things going on, putting different kinds of pressures on different kinds of communities and schools. And some of it is driven by parents looking for different things from their schools that they're getting in private schools, and other pressures may be driven by families not enrolling their students anywhere, perhaps, or fleeing the jurisdiction for fear of immigration enforcement. So those are very different stories.
Thanks, Josh. So my own background and research interests are in the middle grade. So I was particularly intrigued by that finding. Do you have anything you might surmise about in relation to why we're seeing that in that space?
Great point. I hadn't mentioned this, but one of the other striking patterns we saw is that almost all of the enrollment losses, at least in aggregate across the state of Massachusetts, are concentrated in middle grades. So the Massachusetts middle schools are now missing about 20,000 students that we would have expected to be there. Other grades are not missing these students. High school enrollments never really changed very much. Elementary school enrollments and kindergarten enrollments did drop, but they've recovered. And so I think there are two possibilities going on in the middle school story. One is that is a set of students who would have been in early elementary school, kindergarten, first grade, when the pandemic started. And those parents may have just decided to make a different decision than public schools, and those decisions have stuck around. They maybe put their kids in private schools and said, we're just going to keep them there as long as they need to be there. Mm-hmm. The other story, which I don't have real data on this, but I've seen it playing out among at least friends of mine who tend to be college educated folks, is that middle school is this moment where families start to feel like academic stakes get high. It's preparation for high school. And so if they're concerned about the curricular rigor in public schools, or if they're concerned about the learning losses that we've seen and the fears that the schools need to cater to those learning losses is going to detract from their ability to do more advanced work for students who want that rigor, that I think has induced some set of parents to say, well, we're going to go to a different option in this critical moment in a child's development. Mm-hmm. Again, I don't have data. It's just a sort of anecdotal hypothesis.
I'll build on what Josh said, what he has shared, and actually I'll probably, through my anecdotal, validate what you're saying and confirm it. Definitely, the middle school grades have always been almost like that vast desert. There was so much emphasis in public education over the last, 20, 25, 30 years of ed reform on the early grades and high school, and most certainly, the high school graduation requirements, etc. Middle school became this, and I am a former middle school principal, true confession, but it became this place that was forgotten, that, as much as you advocated for, money and grants, really all of the emphasis went to the two ends of the K-12 structure for the most part. And so I think what you saw also was, at a key juncture during the COVID years, where now parents understood that middle school does matter, and that it is just not a holding pattern couple of years for the real education to come back in the high school level. So, in our thinking, what we're looking at is certainly, we listen to the parents who say there's not enough rigor to prepare my child to be successful in high school. And so that's something we have to now pay attention to. There are not enough specialized programming. And it's not just specialized programming in terms of servicing students who are struggling, but specialized programming for all student abilities. We've been very good at the high school level at putting in early college or dual enrollment or even Chapter 74 programming within our comprehensive schools so that students are coming out with stackable credentials along with their high school diploma and in many cases their associate's degree. But what are we doing for that middle school student to make sure that we're attracting the parents, attracting the student, re-engaging them and making them excited about education and learning? When you walk into middle schools across the Commonwealth and actually across the nation, it's pretty much the same as it was 30 or 40 years ago.
Thanks, Mary. It was good to have a middle school perspective. I hadn't realized that you were a middle school principal, so I knew I liked you. So, Stacy, perhaps you could chime in here about thinking a little bit about how parents and students are feeling about schools. And maybe you could talk a little bit about the difference that you see between what parents and students think about schools and sort of the general perspective. I know you think about these things a lot.
Absolutely. And just following along where Mary was, I was a middle school math teacher. It's a middle school reunion today, clearly. And went on from being a middle school teacher to going on to training teachers and parents, and then ultimately training leaders, which would led me to be in contact with lots of principals and parents. 73% of parents feel very positive about education, about their teachers, actually, from the Gallup research. And 66% of students feel very positive about, they give their schools a pretty good grade. And yet, by contrast, when you look at the overall feelings about education, only 41% of parents feel good about education more broadly. So they feel good about their teachers, but about education as an institution, that's where the skepticism can be seen most clearly. And if you talk to Americans generally, not necessarily simply parents, the number goes down. And that number is the number that's been trending down, where only 35% of Americans generally feel positive about education. So there's a little bit of a problem there. If you send your kids to school, you feel your teacher's doing a good job, but you feel something about the institution that's not feeling good. There's even a partisan sort of difference there because Democrats tend to feel, about 44% of them are satisfied with education, whereas Republicans, only about 25% will offer some degrees of satisfaction. So there's the issues of trust and the issues of institutions in our country right now are sort of playing out even in that respect. So we have to pay attention to the fact that there's sort of an institutional need for us to do that bridge building that I spoke of earlier. And unless we sort of address the general needs that the attitudes that Americans have and that parents feel, then we're really not going to be able to draw them back into schools.
Stacy, speaking of bridge building, Lynn has asked a pretty compelling question. If the kids who are still attending schools may be or are those from the most financially challenged families, Chelsea example notwithstanding, what kind of investments do we need to make so that the education those kids get is the envy of all families leaving for the private education sector? So Lynn's asking a pointed question about what we should be doing differently and how we should be resourcing it. I'm asking you, Stacy, but certainly anyone is welcome to chime in.
And I can imagine my colleagues will have some strong opinions about this. I would start with making sure we're supporting our teachers effectively. If we train our teachers well and really invest in making sure that they have the strategies that they need and the resources that they need, then we'll get more of that parents loving the teachers and therefore loving the schools and feeling satisfied by their experiences. I restructured, as superintendent in Framingham, I restructured professional development so that my teachers could work with each other. We went to full inclusion, so we would have teams in each classroom, aides in the classroom, gifted and talented teachers pushing in instead of pulling out. And by changing that process where special ed was about bringing services to the classroom, it made the teachers feel stronger, and I think the students felt more satisfied with the overall experience that they had. So I think we need to restructure the way we think about education broadly. We need to support the teachers by making sure that they feel supported by teams in the classroom and making sure that students feel they have translators and support for the special needs that they have. And if we do those things effectively, then the community will see that we are doing what we can to make sure that we're meeting the needs of all students.
Thanks, Stacy. Anyone else want to chime in on that? Mary, you look like you have something to say.
I'm dying to hear what Mary wants to say.
So, I'll just go off of what Stacy has mentioned. I think all of that innovation and differentiation that we brought to the two ends of the K-12, bring it into the middle. And really, and yes, Get your educators into the room. They have the best ideas in their heads because they talk to the parents more frequently. They talk to the community more frequently and their students. And actually bring in the community and start looking at, we talk about certainly the vision of the graduate in Massachusetts now, and the call for our graduation expectations, and they are talking about the possibility of capstone projects. In Chelsea, when I was there, we started the capstone projects at the high school, but we were already starting to roll it down into middle school. Why should not we look at our middle school students as being far more capable of doing the high school work earlier, and it actually engages and keeps them involved in their own learning. And then the other thing is, yes, there is a concern around AI, but we can't put AI on a shelf. It's not going to go away. So let's engage in the learning. How can we use it in a healthy manner, a safe manner? And actually, I think our students would help us learn it even better. But the other things I would think about is making sure across our Commonwealth that we are investing in multilingualism. Our students in the middle school should have second, third languages that they are learning. And so all of these things that are at a high school level, bring it down into the middle school level, because our students at the middle school level can do far more than we think they can do.
Mm.
Penny, I would add just a little bit to that because this is making me have flashbacks to going into like Fuller Middle School in Framingham and sitting with the parents and recognizing that they were my best advocates to go back into their community and feeling their strong needs and their urgency, and knowing that my teachers who were connected to those parents, that they were the best emissaries that I could have to be able to go back into the communities. And even in my schools on the other side of town, as it were, going and sitting by the fireplace and talking to parents about what their needs and concerns were was the most valuable thing that I could do to keep ear to the ground, but also to get from them the feedback that they needed to change the system.
Mm. And so speaking of changing the system and perhaps doing something different with those middle grades, Joanne has asked if we're interpreting the increase in homeschooling trends as indicating parents who are moving away from the traditional one-size-fits-all model. If so, is there an opportunity for public schools to evolve to serve the needs of families who may be looking for options that better fit their children and their families' needs, flexibility, customized programming, et cetera? And she also asks, is there an opportunity for public schools to unbundle their services to meet the needs of some of the growing homeschooling population? So it's sort of a stacked question there, but it kind of brings us back to the study and what we surmise from that.
Go ahead,
I'll
Josh.
take a stab at the first half of that question, and partially because I also wanted to chime in on the last question as I was gathering my thoughts. One of the things that I think I see among parents I know that have chosen to leave. So all three of my kids are in Cambridge public schools. For the most part, we've been happy, although the middle school experience, I would say, has been the biggest challenge. And the challenge there was that my kids, my older kid in particular, really wanted some additional challenge, particularly when it came to math. And the school system had actually dismantled many of the sort of protocols it had previously had for providing such challenge to students. Students they had been sometimes able to take courses at the high school. That was removed as an option. They had been able to participate in sort of math competitions. That had been removed as an option. There had been, at least in 8th grade, an option to take an advanced math track. That was removed. And so when we went to the school and said, what can you help us with? We were explicitly told that no energy was going to be spent on such students. And that was a hard message to hear. And so we did what lots of parents around us do who have the resources to do it, which is we sent our kids to sort of after school things, after school math tutoring programs, because we basically decided the schools were not going to be the place where they learned math. And that's a really bad feeling to have as a parent. And so I do think middle schools in particular, but the public schools in general, do need to think harder about how do you do this differentiated instruction so that the parents who think that their kids' needs are not right down the middle and are not therefore being served feel that there's something good for them there. And I think that can be the case both for kids who are not challenged enough and also the kids who are struggling. But the schools, we need to find a way to serve all of these families. And the families with means are, by their actions, demonstrating that they've got options and will use those options if they need to.
Mhm.
I think that everyone is responding to some seismic changes in the economy, and we haven't talked necessarily about quiet quitting and people losing work as a result of the pandemic. A lot more people were home and are home, and it's easier to manage your children at home if you're not working than to send them out and to be paying for services, whether it's early childcare or otherwise. So I think we want to look at the future of work to understand that a lot of people are trying to work closer to home, which may mean changing their whole flow, and it may be easier to do homeschooling. We need to think about, yes, the difference between what public and private schools are offering in terms of the flexibility independent schools do provide. I've been on boards of independent schools and also understand how they are creating greater flexibility to be more attractive and to make sure they're meeting the needs of the students in this different economy and different ways in which academics are happening and sports are happening. And those are also very relevant. So we want to think about how those changes in the future of work are also going to impact schools. And I don't think we can thoroughly predict what's going to happen.
I don't think we can predict. I absolutely agree, Stacy, but I'm fearful if we don't start to have more of these conversations, because Josh's, certainly his study, as well as just what we're seeing across the Commonwealth and across the nation, it mirrors really a lot of what's going on with my colleagues in other states and in their school departments. I'm a firm believer in glass half full, and so this is, we're teetering on a crisis-opportunity, right? And so it's a crisis, but it's an opportunity, and it's an opportunity to re-envision, to reimagine, because for me, I am, and from M.A.S.S, we deeply believe that public education is not the right fit for everyone. At the same time, we know we have to reimagine it for for most, and it is the foundation of democracy. And my fear is, if we don't look at public education and start to really get out in front of what it should be looking like for the next 50 years, then what we are going to do is we're going to see more and more of the eroding of community. And that, for me, is very dangerous to both public education and the foundation of democracy.
Thank you, Mary. You mentioned that you have colleagues across the country that are facing similar challenges, and you're having conversations. And we had a question from Stacy in the audience about where they might find data, like we quote from Massachusetts. They're particularly interested in California and nationwide. And I know you have a really good answer for that, I think, Josh. You want to share that?
I have a semi good answer for that,
Okay.
Which is in the paper so the reason we focused on Massachusetts was great at getting out its data in such timely fashion so that we could study the school year that we were in last year. Many states don't do as good a job at that, and I just don't know about California. I do know that the federal government, the Department of Education, at least until recent events have dramatically curtailed its capacities, collected this data from the states, but with a substantial lag. So in our research paper, we actually do the same kind of analysis, but for the nation as a whole, but not for this past school year, the one before that, which was the most recent one available. And one point I'll just make is that Massachusetts is actually not at all unusual in terms of these patterns we're seeing. When we look at the nationwide data 4 years after the pandemic started, the nation as a whole sees a lot of these similar patterns. Public school enrollments are down relative to what you'd have predicted. They're down more for white and Asian families than for Black and Hispanic families, and they're down particularly in middle grades. I don't have a great answer to where would California's data be, but I would suggest most states have decent websites in their departments of education. Highly recommend trying to go there. I would hope that California has timely data on this stuff. And happy to talk to anyone who wants to think about how to actually crunch the numbers here.
You're a great resource for that, Josh. Thank you. Thinking a little bit more about or hypothesizing about the data a bit more. Meg is wondering about long-term effects of what college-educated or affluent families seemed to do in COVID, move to more rural second houses. To the extent that that's true, are we seeing an impact in more rural school districts, or are those students being homeschooled, online academies, or independent schools? That's sort of an interesting parallel thing that was happening, right? We saw a lot of folks moving. And you didn't track that in the data, I would imagine, but do you have some hunches?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the thing I can tell you is that the biggest losses, if we look at a map of Massachusetts, the biggest enrollment losses were in the sort of ring of suburbs around Boston, which tend to be the high income sort of communities of folks who might be commuting into Boston for their jobs. The rural areas actually did not suffer these kind of enrollment losses, at least as much. And maybe that's part of the reason, is that maybe there was a movement of folks. The data we're using is aggregate data. We can't watch individuals move from school district to school district. I've pondered asking the state if we could use their student level data to do something more sophisticated like that, but haven't gotten around to it yet. I don't know if Mary or Stacy.
Yeah, the rural schools are definitely losing students. I don't believe that anybody has really dived into finding out where they've gone to, which is something we do need to start tracking in terms of where people are moving to and what choices are they making. At the same time, there's also a compounding variable in this exodus, and it really is. I mean, New England states, we're actually relatively small and close to each other, and so the high cost of housing in Massachusetts, especially for middle income, younger families. What we have heard is certainly definitely an exodus over the border to New Hampshire, or in the southern Massachusetts to Rhode Island, Connecticut. And so families certainly are making the move through a combination maybe of issues. So housing is a piece that I would say, when we look at K-12 education, we have to be more holistic. We have to take a look at what is the cost of a young family raising a family in Massachusetts. And it's a number of variables, in addition to making sure that we're servicing the educational needs of that particular family. But, healthcare costs, housing costs, food, all of those things become places where families take a step back and say, I think we need to make another decision.
Mm-hmm.
I'll just add that, the focus of our study was on the impact of the pandemic, but there's a separate just overall trend going on in Massachusetts, which is in terms of children, Massachusetts is a shrinking state for exactly the reasons Mary has talked about. So our study was focused on, even though the state was shrinking in terms of its school age population, was there something additional the pandemic did? And the answer is yes. But this broader trend that just the number of children living in the state is shrinking, that predates the pandemic and is some deeper, arguably, dysfunction about our public policy.
Part of the conversation and where Josh is taking it raises the issue of in what ways are we analyzing the data? And because we can't fully answer that last question, it really begs for doing deeper analysis of the data. And part of what I think would be useful and actually create more trust from families is more data accessibility, just to make for schools and districts, and even at the state level, as Mary implied, having this conversation and getting the data out there will be really helpful. Ultimately, it's that sense that we're partnering together to make things better. School districts need to partner within their community organizations and religious and political organizations to sort of make them feel connected. But we also need to partner in the conversation around how will we manage the changes that are afoot, and that is really the only way that we'll be successful in moving our systems forward.
We have a set of questions in our chat that are inviting us to think ahead about college enrollment, some of the implications that this might have for higher education and higher education institutions more generally. So we have someone asking particularly about if the trends in the data suggest that we should recognize and as a result change how we engage potential students in higher ed, and how the trends might impact college enrollment generally. And then another one specific to implications for teacher preparation in Massachusetts. So I'm sort of coupling those together because I think they're related. Anyone want to tackle that group?
So I'll take a stab at it. That's a very complex question, right? And so, you know, I think yes. First, the easy part would be to say yes. These are leading indicators for a lagging impact that will take place at higher ed, which we're already starting to see impact on higher ed. Many students are choosing not to go for a higher education degree. And again, is it the variable of cost? Is it the variable of, return for investment? These are all conversations that I've had with students, but also with families. They're really, it's a generation of parents who are actually saying to their children, you might want to think about, or question a higher ed degree. And so that's a piece where I think higher ed also, just like K-12, may have to start really looking at the market and, and how do you re-envision the market? How do you re-envision meeting students where they are and where they need to go for, as Stacy said, the job market that is in front of us? And the only way to do that is to have the families, have the students in the room, talking both postgraduate students as well as students choosing not to enter into higher ed. I think when you talk about teachers, absolutely. I think, K-12 re-envisioning what, education will look like will have an impact on our teacher prep programs. Right now, are we talking about the vision of the graduate in our teacher prep programs? K-12 is. K-12, actually, we did a survey at M.A.S.S. 80% of our districts already have a vision of the graduate. The state is now putting it in, but they've had the vision of the graduate. Granted, it's 275 separate visions of the graduate. We're trying to be consistent. But the sheer fact, do teacher prep programs, talk about that, explain it, so that's just one example, and there are probably a million more, but absolutely, it's we don't live in silos. As much as we think we can make changes in our own little domain and we have control of it, we don't. Humanity is not siloed, and therefore one thing impacts another.
Yeah, I definitely want to pick up on that. I mean, really, that question almost speaks as much as anything to the demand on higher education to reconsider itself, its very existence, and because we're moving toward credentialing. If the future of work is much different than it has been, then it's really about what credentials for particular skills can I get, and is it worthwhile to me, which is what the families are asking. So higher ed will look at its admissions criteria and change them on the basis of students coming who are looking very different, and change actually what education looks like. In our master's program here for leadership, we've spent the last few months and up until yesterday totally redesigning sort of how we see the course students flowing through our courses, because we want to make sure they come out with critical skills and knowledge to be able to do the work that they're called for. So it really is a demand on us in higher ed at the master's and at the bachelor level to rethink how we do education.
So true. Thank you. Thanks. We are running out of time, much to my chagrin. I apologize for that. I have so many more questions then, so I apologize to the audience that we're not going to get to all of them today. Before we do, though, Josh, I'd love to, I know you have a data set that may be available, so I wonder if you would just take the last word here, looking at the bigger picture, maybe summarize what you think these trends might mean for the future of public education in Massachusetts, especially if enrollment doesn't rebound.
Yeah, so 10 seconds on that, I'll just say, my fear is that we'll continue to see this erosion of trust and sort of belief in the power of public schools. And so I'm hoping school leaders and policymakers find ways to turn this around, perhaps by being more responsive to families in the ways that Stacy and Mary have talked about. The data nerd in me will say that for those of you who would like to sort of see the data itself and play with it yourself, particularly if you're interested in what's going on in your own school district, we are in the process of taking this data that the state makes publicly available and creating what will be a public-facing dashboard that you should be able to very easily go to and say, I want to see what's happening in Boston, over the last 10 years for all students, for middle school students, for white students. I want to see statewide. I want to see Brookline. I want to see, Great Barrington, whatever district you're interested in. So my hope is that we'll be able to turn what is sometimes a very sort of narrow academic kind of product into something that has a piece that is accessible widely and can continue to spark some of these conversations that I hope are useful. So stay tuned. I think it's going to be something like 6 weeks before that thing is ready. Apologies that it wasn't ready today.
No, that's terrific. And it's such a great example of an outcome from research that can be immediately useful and impact policy ultimately. So very much appreciate it. Again, my apologies to the audience for not getting to all the questions today, but you've asked some wonderful ones. And thank you all. It's been a really insightful discussion. To our audience, if you're interested in pursuing some of these ideas through further study, you might want to know that BU Wheelock's Education Policy Program is in the top 25 in the nation. And Wheelock Educational Policy Center is doing amazing work, and those two things are connected. We have included Josh's email in case you'd like more details about his study and about the data sets that he was just mentioning. And we'd love to hear from you and welcome you to BU Wheelock. So please see the email on the screen to contact our admissions office. I really hope to see you all next month for our Fair Student Loans webinar, where we'll explore student debt forgiveness programs and overlooked state initiatives. And our panel will discuss accessibility barriers, systemic inequities, and policy solutions to better support historically marginalized groups. You won't want to miss that. So thanks, everyone, and have a great rest of the week.